Hello everyone and welcome to Balquell's Books. Today we are talking about The Transmigration of Timothy Archer by Philip K. Dick, which is his final novel that he wrote before his death and the third novel in the so-called Valis trilogy. Now you may have heard of this book, you may even have read this book, but you have never watched a YouTube video in which I talk about this book. Unless, of course, you're watching this for a second time. Now, the Transmigration of Timothy Archer, as I said, is part of the Valis trilogy, at least according to some people. It's somewhat ambiguous whether this is the third book in the trilogy or the book he was planning to write after this that he never finished because of his death was actually the third one. For the purposes of this analysis, I choose to believe that this is the third book in the Valis trilogy, simply because it shares a lot of the thematic elements of the other two books. Now, this trilogy, like you may guess from how I'm speaking of it, is not an exact sort of chronological trilogy of books in which the characters and the events feed in from one to the other directly. It's a bit more of a sort of thematic trilogy. The three books deal with similar ideas and concepts, and specifically they are dealing with the idea of God and sort of man's relationship to God, or sort of an absolute supreme divinity. The first book, Valis, Valis stands for Vast Active Living Intelligence System, in case you were wondering. The first book, Valis, follows a man named Horse Lover Fat, and he receives a transmission from an alien entity that reveals to him certain knowledge that he was not aware of before. And so the book is about his attempts to understand this knowledge and figure out where it came from, and sort of understand what sort of being or entity is capable of transmitting such a transmission to him. And so in this book, we sort of deal with God as this unintelligible, inconceivable, sort of mysterious entity that we can receive information from, but can never quite comprehend or understand or communicate with. In the second book, The Divine Invasion, we're dealing with a very different God. Because in the Divine Invasion, we are dealing with the literal Hebrew God Yahweh, who's referred to as Yah in the book. In the story, the main character comes across Yahweh on an alien planet that humans have colonized, and Yahweh has been sort of evicted from Earth, sort of sent away, and is living on this planet. And he tells the main character to help this woman who lives nearby who has multiple sclerosis. Eventually, this woman becomes pregnant by way of Yahweh, or Yah, and they have to take this son, this baby, back to Earth. And we end up with this very strange story told often from the perspective of this son as he discovers his own godlyhood, discovers his sort of mission, I guess, his purpose of bringing God back to Earth and sort of fighting these evil forces of, satanic whatever. It's a very, very strange novel. And unlike Valis, we are dealing with a God as a literal being. The characters in this story literally interact with God, and he physically manifests himself. In the Transmigration of Timothy Archer, we have a third idea of God, which is God as a sort of psychological condition. In Timothy Archer, unlike Divine Invasion, God doesn't manifest, his will on Earth physically. We almost get this sense that God is a manifestation of a human idea, that we need this idea of God for some sort of purpose, or to properly survived, sort of cope with being a person on Earth. So Timothy Archer, the main character, is an archbishop of the Diocese of California in the Episcopal Church, and he's a somewhat absent-minded fellow. He seems to live in a different world. He lives in the world of ideas and doesn't quite seem to belong in the physical realm. We see incidents of him, he'll plug his car into the gas station and then drive away with the pump still in. Or he'll be eating at a restaurant and someone will ask him, well, how was the food? And he won't even remember what he just ate. He seems to not really have much concern for physical things and only care about ideas. He is also a former lawyer and thus an apt rhetorician and great at arguing for his own ideas and of convincing people that he is or convincing people of what he wishes to convince them of. He has this sort of charm and charisma of being a strange individual, but of seeming quite knowledgeable and seeming to be in tune with something that other people are not. And therefore he's able to almost manipulate people for his own needs. He almost doesn't see them as people with their own goals, but is able to use them and convince them with the help of books and quotations and things like these to help him out. Interestingly enough, Timothy Archer, is actually based on a real person that Philip K. Dick happened to know, named James Pike, who was a somewhat interesting individual in his own right, and a very fascinating and influential historical figure. I'm not going to be focusing too much on the parallels between those two. Mainly I'm going to be focusing on Timothy Archer as a character that Dick uses, and the situations he sets him up in the novel. But I'd encourage you to check out James Pike if you're interested in that. Now, this book is narrated by Timothy Archer's daughter-in-law, who is named Angel Archer. And so, obviously, being his daughter-in-law, she is married to his son and knows him quite well, and also introduces Timothy Archer to his mistress, who is named Kirsten. And Timothy Archer, being a bishop, his wife has died, but being a bishop, probably not the kind of guy who's supposed to be taking a mistress, but he manages to convince himself that this is a good thing and he's allowed to do this because he is Timothy Archer and he has whatever he has on his side. Now, Angel Archer is well educated. She went to college and she went to school. She's somewhat cynical because of this, and she's an atheist, unlike Timothy Archer. And she's sort of drawn in by Tim's influence and his sort of aura of authority, but at the same time is quite critical of both him and also critical of herself for being drawn in this way. She will try to argue with Tim, and he'll win the argument, but after it's done, she'll think, well, he shouldn't have won that argument. That, he just played me, So they have this interesting relationship, and as the narrator, she brings you close to Timothy Archer as a person. So you get to see him as an authoritative and a sort of charismatic individual, but also as a bit of a foolish guy at times, and you get to see all the aspects of him. Now, in the book, Timothy Archer suffers a crisis of faith, and this is related to the discovery of certain ancient documents in the Dead Sea Desert, which are not real, made up for the purposes of this story, and they're called the Zadokite documents. Now, Zadok, the priest, is a real guy, but these documents are not. And what these Zadokite documents contain are certain sayings and parables attributed to Jesus Christ. However, they date to several centuries prior to Christ. And obviously this is a problem. The significance of Christ is as a major sea change in the sort of story or the path of sort of human religious knowledge. And his ideas and his concept of eternal life and all this are almost proof of his being the Son of God. Now, if you take away all this knowledge that he's supposed to have, this sort of divine knowledge, and realize that is actually he is just carrying on in a tradition that started with someone prior to him, then it is a lot harder to believe that he is truly the Son of God. And when you are an archbishop, that's a problem when you start to wonder if Jesus is really the Son of God. Another thing these Zadokite documents talk about is the Eucharist. And obviously, if you have the Eucharist without Christ, that raises a lot of questions about what is the significance of this rite. If you don't know, the Eucharist is when you eat the bread and the wine that are the body and blood of Christ. Now, if there's no Christ, you're just eating bread and wine, and, what good does that do you? What these researchers seem to have, what they hypothesize and what Timothy Archer comes to believe is that this bread and this wine is made of a psychedelic mushroom named anochi, which is Hebrew, I believe, for I am, or something of that sort. And so these Zadokites and the early Christians, therefore, are a mushroom cult of the sort that you would see in 1960s California, which is when this story takes place. And so, obviously, when confronted with this information, Timothy Archer, his sort of, the floor falls out from under him in a way. But being Timothy Archer, he finds something new to believe in. Now, while Tim and his mistress are out analyzing these documents in England, back in California, his son Jeff commits suicide. And obviously this is a terrible event in the life of Angel Archer, who is our narrator, obviously being his wife, and also Tim and Kirsten are quite put out. They're somewhat traumatized. And this is partially because it's they believe that Jeff, Timothy's son, was actually in love with Kirsten, the mistress, and that he was very jealous of his father and had a lot of very complicated emotions related to his father. And Jeff, too, was a sort of scholar and things like this, and was very much following in the footsteps. Now, this guilt and this... So the guilt that Kirsten and Timothy feel particularly Tim, this guilt and this trauma ends up convincing Tim that Jeff is actually still alive, but not in the Christian afterlife sense of going to heaven, but that he is corporeally existing on earth, that he can send them signs, and they experience these phenomena, they call them, where glass in their house is broken and their nails are cut in the night, and all these sort of strange phenomena, and they think, well, clearly this is Tim's dead son sending messages and trying to tell us about something. And so they get involved in all these sort of spiritual people and these seers and these having seances and all this sort of thing that you do when you think that your dead son is alive. And Tim even goes so far as to start writing a book about these events. And this book is not orthodox according to the Episcopalian Christian religion, and thus he has to step down from being a bishop. Angel is watching all this happen, watching this sort of decline, you could say, of Timothy Archer, and starts to wonder, about the value of being educated, the value of having all these books and being able to argue well and all these things, if what it's going to lead you, as soon as you're confronted with these traumatic events, it sort of leads you into this strange pseudo magic realm, that Tim and Kirsten have sort of found themselves in. And the book presents us with quite an interesting foil to Timothy Archer in the character of Bill, who is Kirsten's son from a previous marriage, Kirsten being Tim's mistress. So Bill is perhaps autistic. It's never stated explicitly that he's autistic, but he certainly has many of those qualities that you'd associate with autism, and he is schizophrenic. And he is quite literally incapable of abstract thought. So we find this out when Angel first meets him, and she thinks, well, this is a nice guy, and, she obviously sees that he has certain communication skill issues, and she starts to wonder, and so she sort of quizzes him about some proverbs, What do we mean when we say, when it rains, it pours? And what he says is, well, sometimes it rains a lot, right? So he's very much of this earth, and he's obsessed with material things. He loves cars. He loves talking about cars and the history of cars and all this sort of stuff. And because of his grounded nature, he is not able to be carried away by Tim's sort of theoretical arguments or his analogical arguments. When Tim tries to make an abstract point or tries to reason by analogy, Bill's not having any of it. So you end up with this particularly funny conversation about midway through the book when Bill comes out and says, I think it's really stupid that you think your son is alive when he's dead. He just sort of says it, And Tim, as he always does when he's involved in an argument, he brings out a book and he starts quoting these things, and he's talking about, how can we know anything, what really constitutes proof, and all this sort of philosophical stuff. And Bill is not convinced, so Tim starts trying to make an analogy to a car. He's like, well, you like cars, so I'll talk about cars and analogize it back. But Bill gets completely sidetracked by the car discussion, and they never make it back to the original point. And so Angel, sort of observing these interactions and observing the sort of dichotomy between Bill and Tim, or Tim and Bill, I guess, she starts to wonder about the value of all the education that she has gone through, and about all this obsession with books and theoretical ideas in general. That Bill seems to have a decent head on his shoulders and can make his way through the world and sort of understand certain things, whereas Tim and Angel and Jeff are constantly confused, and they're almost unable to see what's right before them because they're so lost in the clouds of doubt and things like this. And she starts to question, who's sane and who's not sane, or you might say who is mentally healthy and who's not, between Bill and Tim, right? Because Bill is in and out of institutions, in and out of jail because of his developmental issues, but Tim, who is treated by the world as a sane person who they let out free in the world to do whatever he likes, is making these mistakes and throwing away his career and his religion and all these other things. In tragic fashion, Tim comes to an early demise due to his new obsessions. He gives up on the seers and the diviners and the seances, but he thinks that what he must do now to test his faith or to find out the truth behind the universe and religion and everything is he must travel himself to the Dead Sea Desert and find the Anochi mushroom so that he can know for sure what was going on back there, with these Zadokites and all this. And so he abandons everything he's got. He already abandoned his bishopric. Now he abandons his new career that he started in a think tank, and he's abandoned his new book and all this, and he's out. Goes to the Dead Sea Desert and dies because he's just some guy, and the desert is real big, and there's not a lot of water out there. So he dies in the desert. And this is the sort of tragic fall of Timothy Archer. And so what can we learn about him? It seems to me that for Tim, God, religion, spirituality is a sort of coping mechanism. And I know this is a common criticism that atheists level against religious people. But I think this book is fairly explicit that Tim specifically is a bit of a dilettante when it comes to spiritual ideas, that he's able to convince himself and others of any sort of idea that he can come up with that suits whatever he wants to do, whatever he's interested in, whatever he's obsessed with. And when Jeff dies, you see that because he feels that his previous beliefs couldn't reconcile him with this new trauma and this guilt, that he must change to something else that will allow him to understand it better, allow him to cope with it better. Jeff, his son, on the other hand, who is an atheist, who isn't religious at all, he's also unable to cope. And this is proven by his suicide, that he's unable to cope with the vicissitudes, I suppose, of life. Angel Archer, on the other hand, the narrator of the story, finds a different way to cope. And the way she does this is via detachment. As she sees Tim falling further and further away from her, and Kirsten too, she sort of detaches herself. She stops trying to have any influence on their lives, and she becomes almost disillusioned with knowledge and action at all. And she starts living almost as an automaton, as someone with absolutely no agency. She thinks, I'm college educated, I've read all these books, but what's the point? What does it get me if Tim, this man who was even more intelligent than I was, ended up in the way that he ended up? And so we get this sort of nihilistic feeling from Angel Archer. And at the end of the book, even Bill, after Tim's death, he starts to believe that he's being possessed by Tim's personality. And whether this is truly happening or not is actually somewhat unclear in the book. But I think we can see this as Bill almost being corrupted by the influence of Tim, that he's losing his grounded nature, and that he's starting to enter into this fog of doubt, of this unsurety of anything, and this strange educated malaise, and so Angel feels that she's lost Bill. Bill, the person who was always keeping her on the ground, is now floating off in the air. And so she's lost Tim, she's lost Jeff, she's lost Kirsten, she's lost Bill. And so Angel starts to feel that this search for knowledge, this search for truth, this spirituality in general, this strange method that people have for coping with their traumas is no good. Another important sort of motif that carries throughout the book is that the day on which the book sort of has a frame story where Angel Archer years later is remembering the story of Tim and Bill and Kirsten and Jeff about a few years later. I think 3 or 4 years later. I don't think it's explicitly stated, but a couple years later. And the day on which the sort of frame story is taking place is the day of John Lennon's death in 1980. And John Lennon's death, of course, was a very pivotal moment for this particular generation of people, and particularly the type of people that were living in California and were involved in the circles that Tim and Angel are involved in. It is very much the end of an era, the sort of hippie era, this sort of loss of innocence moment, after which nothing's really funny anymore. Nothing's really the same. Something has been lost by this generation of people, symbolized by this event. Not necessarily caused by this event, but you can see it's this very important moment in American culture. And you can see this loss of innocence in Angel, that, it's not funny anymore. Tim's whims and his ideas and his book learning, it's ended in tragedy, and all these people that she loved were taken away from her because of their sort of spiritual ideas, at least partially. And in the final scene, we see Angel Archer has grown up in a way, but not necessarily in a good way. We saw earlier that Tim used his charisma almost to manipulate people in order to bring them to his side, in order to bring them to his ideas. And what Angel Archer does in the final scene is that she manipulates someone, but not to bring them to her side and not for her ideas, but to gain some sort of monetary gain for her career. And at the end of the book, she says, sort of thinking about this manipulation she's just done, and she thinks, Tim would have liked that if he were here. And whether that's true or not, you can sort of see how Angel has corrupted Tim's influence or his legacy in using these sort of base manipulative tactics for a pretty, or not as lofty a goal as he would say he was using it for. And so that is the end of the story of Angel Archer and Timothy Archer. I would say that the Transmigration of Timothy Archer is Philip K. Dick's most emotional novel, and perhaps his most personal novel as well. Obviously, all his books are based on ideas that were very important to him or very interesting to him. But this book in particular feels like it's got an emotional core that's not often present in his other works. The characters are much more fleshed out here, and we get a much deeper sort of psychological look at them, rather than them being sort of vessels for ideas or catalysts for events. And to me, this almost feels like an evolution or a hint of a new direction in Philip K. Dick's work, even relative to the two books prior. Unfortunately, we never got to see where this was leading him, because he died soon after the publication of this book, and he was quite young when he died. He was still in his 50s, so it's quite unfortunate in that way. But that does not mean I don't mean to say that Timothy Archer is important only as a hint of what could have come, but in itself it is a very successful novel in my eyes. And I think it's a very self-critical novel from Philip K. Dick's perspective. If you read more of his works, and especially if you read some of his nonfiction, you'll see that, like Timothy Archer, he was a bit of an intellectual dilettante. He would be able to convince himself of this idea and then that idea and then this next idea based on his whims, what was interesting to him at the time, and he could dig deep and deep and deep and almost convince you, and then at the end he comes back and says, well, I don't know about that. Well, what about this thing, you know? So he does have a bit of that Tim in him, and I think part of this novel is him questioning why he is so obsessed with these ideas of consciousness, of what it means to be human, and things like this, these very lofty philosophical questions. Why, he's questioning, why am I so obsessed with these? Where is it getting me? Has it actually gained me anything in my life, or am I being led on the same sort of destructive path? And I think the book is him trying to almost moderate himself, that interest in philosophy and these questions is fun and interesting and often valuable, but if you take it a little bit too far, you end up in the tragedy of Timothy Archer. In comparison to the book prior, The Divine Invasion, which I spoke about earlier, that book is incredibly inhuman. The characters are gods or people close to gods. They're very cryptic, and they're dealing with problems that the average person definitely could not understand or relate to. So in contrast, Transmigration of Timothy Archer is a very emotional novel and just a very interesting counterpoint. These two books, reading them in close succession, is quite an experience to see one author capable of these two very diverse types of novels. And so, obviously, I think this book is well worth a read for anyone interested in Philip K. Dick or interested in any of the ideas that he likes to explore in his books. I think this is I'm not going to say it's his best book or my favorite book. I don't think there's any point in saying that, but I think it's a great book. I think it's fantastic. That's it. That's what I gotta say about The Transmigration of Timothy Archer by Philip K. Dick. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I enjoyed making it. Goodbye.